Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Bava Batra. We are up to Perek Mishnah Vav. Today's Mishnah should be Le'elu Nishmat Neria ben Svetlana Renbai V'Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov Chana bad Miriam Sason ben Ryan Yoshua ben Shifra Menuchatam began Eden Amen and Lavdi ben Chaim Lechaim v'Derefua Shelemav Daniel Shalom ben Rosa betoch Shachole Israel and Dachlama Merav Binyamin Od Sion Chai ben Dvorah. The Mishnah discusses when either one or both of the parties to a sale has the right to withdraw from a sale because of a claim of sales fraud, meaning a claim that the items being sold were not what they were supposed to be. The Mishnah begins, Arba midot b'mochrin. There are 4 different rulings in cases of sales fraud. In every case where someone wishes to withdraw from a sale because of a claim of fraud, one of these 4 rulings will apply. There are other cases of fraud, such as price fraud, where the price charged was too high or too low, that have different laws which are not discussed here. The 4 rulings are: 1. Only the buyer can withdraw. 2. Only the seller can withdraw. 3. Neither one of them can withdraw. And 4. Either one of them can withdraw. The Mishnah lists cases where each of these rulings apply. The first case, Machar lo chitim yafot, if the seller sold him wheat and told him that it was of fine quality, v'nimtzeu raot, and it was found to be of poor quality, halokeach yachol lachzor bo, the buyer has the right to withdraw from the sale, but the seller does not. Since the buyer is the one who was cheated, it is up to him to decide whether he wants to proceed with the sale. If he decides he wants the wheat anyway, the seller may not cancel the sale. Therefore, even if the price of wheat went up, and the seller now wants to keep his wheat so he can resell it for a higher price, he cannot use this excuse to cancel the sale. Since he was not the one cheated, he has no right to withdraw. The second case, Raot, if the buyer told the seller the wheat was of poor quality, v'nimtzu yafot, and it was found to be wheat of fine quality, meaning the buyer misled the seller, telling him that the wheat he had for sale was of poor quality in comparison to other wheat available for sale in the city, when in truth it was wheat of fine quality. Mocher yachol lachzor bo, then the law is the opposite. Only the seller has the right to withdraw from the sale, but not the buyer. Since in this case it is the seller who has been wronged, he may choose to cancel the sale, but if he wishes to sell the wheat in any case, the buyer must accept it. Meaning if the price of wheat fell, for example, so that the buyer now wants to withdraw because he can buy even fine wheat at a lower price, he may not do so because he was not cheated in the sale. The third case, Raot v'nimtzu raot, if the seller told him that he was selling wheat of poor quality, and it was indeed found to be of poor quality, Yafot v'nimtzu yafot, or if he told him that he was selling wheat of fine quality, and it was indeed found to be of fine quality, and neither one has the right to withdraw from the sale. Now the novelty of these rulings is as follows. In the case where the sale was of poor quality wheat, if the price of wheat went down after the sale, and the buyer now wishes to withdraw so he can buy wheat for a cheaper price, he cannot claim, I really want a wheat of fine quality, I only said that I was agreeing to buy poor quality wheat, because a buyer always claims that the quality of wheat he has is poor, even if it's not. Similarly, in the case where the sale was of fine quality wheat, if the price of wheat went up, and the seller now wishes to withdraw from the sale so he can sell the wheat for a higher price, he cannot claim, I really wanted to sell wheat of poor quality, I said it was fine wheat, only because the seller always says that his wares are fine even if they are not. Neither of these claims is accepted because we followed the words of the agreement as it was made. The fourth case, Shechamtit, if the seller told him that he was selling him red wheat, v'nimtzet levana, and it was found to be white wheat, levana v'nimtzet shechamtit, or if he told him that he was selling him white wheat and it was found to be red wheat, etzim shel zayit, or similarly, if he told him that he was selling him olive wood, v'nimtzu shel shikma, and it was found to be sycamore wood, shel shikma v'nimtzu shel zayit, or that it was sycamore wood and it was found to be olive wood, yain v'nimtza chometz, or similarly, if the seller told him that he was selling him wine and it was found to be vinegar, chometz v'nimtza yain, or vinegar and it was found to be wine, shneim yechulin lachzor bahen, in all cases of this type, either one of the two can withdraw from the sale if he wishes. Since some people prefer red wheat and others white wheat yields finer flour when it's ground, but red wheat yields more flour per pound of grain. And some require one type of wood rather than another, or wine rather than vinegar, or vice versa. Either the buyer or the seller can cancel the sale by claiming that the item was not what they agreed upon. These are all sales made in error, mikach ta'ut, which can be cancelled by either party, In the earlier case of the Mishnah, however, where the wheat was supposed to be of fine quality and it was found to be of poor quality, the seller may not cancel the sale because everyone prefers wheat of fine quality. Now, either buyer or seller can void the sale in these cases, even though the items are somewhat similar. Certainly, if an item is completely different from what was agreed upon, for example, they agreed upon a sale of wheat and it was found to be barley, the sale can be canceled by either party. And that is then of Mishnah Vav. Now, when something is sold, the sale is considered complete once the buyer makes a kinyan, a legal act of acquisition, upon the item. At that point, the item belongs to the buyer, and neither party can withdraw from the sale. Mishnah Zayin discusses several types of kinyanim that can be made to acquire various items. Hamochel perot lechavero, if someone sells produce such as barrels of grain or sacks of nuts to his fellow, mashach, and the buyer pulled them from the public street in which they were located into another courtyard that he owns at least partially, either a courtyard that he owns or an alley next to the public street called a sitma that was set aside for any person to use as his own in order to make kinyanim. Velo madad, then even if he did not measure the amount of grain or nuts that he took, kana, he has acquired them and the sale is complete. By pulling the items from the street into a place that is his, he has performed the kinyan mishicha, literally pulling, and the items are his. Although he does not yet know exactly how much he has bought, he can find out later when he examines his purchase more closely. However, this is only if the buyer and seller agreed upon a price per barrel or sack for the goods, so the buyer knows approximately how much he will have to pay. If no price was set, the kinyan is not effective, since the buyer is not even sure that he will be keeping the goods, for the seller may demand a higher price than he is willing to pay. Now, Mishicha works to acquire the merchandise even if it was still in the seller's barrels when the buyer performed the Mishicha, the pulling. The Mishnah now discusses an opposite case, Madad. However, if the seller measured the grain or nuts and placed them into the barrels of the buyer, v'lo mashach, but the buyer did not pull them from the street into a courtyard that he owns, lo kana, he has not acquired them because he did not make a kinyan. Having the goods loaded into his barrels does not acquire them for the buyer since they are still in the street, which he does not own. Even if the buyer then pulled the barrels into the street themselves, in the street itself, he still does not acquire the items because Mishicha does not work in the street. However, if the buyer was the one who took the merchandise from the seller's barrels and loaded it into his own barrels, he would acquire it because by lifting the merchandise from the seller's barrels, he has performed the kinyan of hagba'ah, lifting, which is effective even if it is done in the street. Now, even though back in our case where the seller measured the grain or nuts and placed them into the barrels of the buyer, but the buyer did not pull them from the street into a courtyard that he owns, he has not acquired them because he did not make a kinyan, even though he knows exactly how much he is buying and the produce is already in his barrels. Since he did not yet pull them from the street, the sale is not yet complete, and either party can withdraw from the sale. Although one who withdraws from a sale, even at this point, can be subject to the curse called a mishepara, which the sages imposed on someone who breaks an agreement, he is still legally permitted to retract. After a kinyan, however, one cannot retract, meaning the retraction is ineffective and the goods belong to the buyer. The Mishnah now offers some advice for someone who wishes to complete a sale without having to pull the merchandise into his own property. And if the buyer is smart and wishes to complete the sale quickly, for example, if the buyer is afraid that the market price for the goods will rise, and he therefore wishes to complete the sale quickly so the seller will be unable to retract, socher et mekomani, can rent its place. Meaning, if the produce is lying in the property of the seller, instead of having to pull it into his own property in order to acquire it, the buyer can simply rent the area from the seller. The produce will then be lying on his land, and he automatically acquires it through the kinyan called chatzel, literally courtyard, without having to move the produce at all. A person can use his courtyard to acquire movable property for him if the movables are located within the courtyard and he is watching it. This is known as kinyan chatzel, literally acquisition by courtyard. By renting the seller's property, the buyer makes it into his own chatzel temporarily, and he can use it to acquire the goods immediately without having to perform any other kinyan. Until this point, the Mishnah has been discussing the sale of barrels and large sacks, which are very heavy and are usually dragged rather than lifted. Such items can be acquired through Mishicha. Mishicha is considered an inferior type of kinyan, while Hagba'ah, lifting, is considered a superior kinyan. The sages allowed a person to use Mishicha, pulling, only if the goods are very heavy and difficult to lift. The Mishnah now discusses how one must acquire smaller, lighter items. If someone buys flax from his fellow, he has not acquired it until he actually picks it up and moves it from place to place. Since flax is slippery and pulls apart easily, it was packed in small, light bundles, and movables that are easily lifted must be acquired through the kinyan of Hagba'ah. Therefore, to acquire the flax, he must pick it up. If he pulls it without lifting it, he does not acquire it, because the commentators explain when Hagba'ah is possible, the sages did not permit one to acquire such items with mishicha, with pulling. The Mishnah notes that there is one instance where one can acquire flax without having to lift it at all. But if the flax was still attached to the ground of the seller's field, and the buyer detached even a tiny amount of it, kana, he has thereby acquired all of it. By picking a small amount of the flax, he acquires a temporary ownership in the land, which allows him to acquire the flax at the same time. In this case, the seller said to the buyer, go and improve my land and acquire all the flax that is on it. The acquisition of the flax works in two steps. By uprooting a small bit of the flax, the buyer has performed a service for the seller that is worth money, and it is as if he has paid the seller to rent his land for a short time. With the quote-unquote payment of the work, he legally acquires the land. Rental payment of money is one of the three kinyanim that can be used to legally acquire land. And when he acquires the land, he automatically acquires the rest of the flax that is still on the land along with it through the mechanism known as kinyan agav, which allows one who buys land and movable property at the same time to make a kinyan on the land and acquire the movable property along with it. Although most of the flax is still attached to the ground, since it's ready to be cut, it is considered a movable item that can be acquired through kinyan agav. And that is an abotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.